probably received email messages from me. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Stephen Hausman to you all. Steve was a federal employee at the National Institutes of Health for 31 years. For about 15 of those, you were an
Deputy Director of an Institute.
Yeah, he was Deputy Director of an Institute. Steve has a science background, a little bit too complicated for me to explain what type of science background. In addition to that, Steve served in the capacity, or was an SAS employee for about 17 years. When Steve retired from the federal government, he decided to become a contractor to provide ethics program assistance and ethics training to other parts of HHS. Steve is the person who designed and did the implementation of the NIH ethics management system. So if any of you all have worked up at NIH, you've seen the automated system they have up there for managing the ethics documentation. It's completely automated. Steve, who also has a computer background, was the key person in designing that and implementing that. For those of you that have just come in, we do have handouts, and also it's important that you sign in. There's a sign-in sheet going around so that you can receive credit for being here, because I don't know too many of you, and I won't remember who was here. So I'm going to turn this over to Steve.
Thank you, Kathleen. This is a small enough group, so if anybody has any questions, please feel free. Technology does have its limits, though. Please feel free to ask them. You have handouts. The handouts are everything that I'm going to be talking about, and actually will include a few things that I'm not going to talk about. The handouts include the SF-278, which is the public financial disclosure form, and I'm going to stick mainly to the 450, which is the confidential financial disclosure form, which most of you file. The main difference is that, well, between the fact it's confidential versus public, there's much more detail required on the public form. What I've done is put all of this information, all the slides, and there'll be a video of this presentation as well on my website. And actually the previous one, hausmantech.com. And there'll be an ethics tab over there. And when you click on that and go down to training activities, this is where there's a PDF of the slides. Shortly afterwards, when I finish editing it, I'll be putting a little YouTube presentation of the, maybe a combination of all the seminars that I've been giving here. So what are we going to be talking about? Well, financial disclosure, obviously. Confidential financial disclosure mostly. Gift acceptance issues, such as widely attended gatherings, and free attendance at meetings, and meals and receptions. Official duty activities, outside activities, the Hatch Act, which is especially relevant this year for political activities getting close to the election season. Social media, I'll be touching on that a little bit. And misuse of position, again, if we have time, I'll be touching on that. But the details and examples are all in the handouts.
Let me interrupt you just
Yes.
a few folks have just walked in. I don't think I have enough handouts. So when you sign the sign-in sheet, put an asterisk next to your name saying that you need a copy of the handout, and I'll email it to you.
So why study ethics? Well, I guess one reason, because you were told to be here. But there is the Washington Post. Trust me, you don't want to have your name and or picture in the Washington Post associated with an ethics transgression. It's not good to happen. You've heard of Enron, you've heard of Jack Madoff, Representative Rangel, Jack Abramoff, all these people and many, many more. You have no problem finding examples of egregious ethics behavior all the time, and that is a problem. There's common sense, and of course there is the law. Now I like quotes. If you should once forfeit the confidence of your fellow citizens, you can never regain their respect and esteem. Anybody? Somebody in the last session actually knew who said this. Yes? Yeah, Abe Lincoln. You've heard. Relativity applies to physics, not ethics. Also, of course. Excellent. A man without ethics is like a wild geese loosed upon the world. Well, you have to have a little background in French literature. That's Albert Camus. This is a screenshot of the Department of Justice website when they talked about an FDA chemist and son charged with trading on inside information. Now, the Securities and Exchange Commission has an algorithm. They track every trade made on every stock market. And if for some reason a stock should go up precipitously and you have bought large amounts of that stock beforehand, they will know it. And that will draw their attention to you. Or if you sold stock or sold it short, bought it short, if it's going down, they will track you. And so they found this FDA chemist was doing that. The stock was going up. A day or two before, he bought large amounts of the stock. And that was enough to get them a wiretap. And it turns out that he and his son made about $4 million trading. He pled guilty of insider trading. He's currently in jail. Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has up until now excluded itself from insider trading rules, but they're talking about including themselves eventually. We will see what happens. And there are very specific conflict of interest laws. This is 18 U.S.C., the United States Code. These are criminal statutes. Okay? These can be accompanied by jail time, by fines, a variety of things. 201, bribery and illegal gratuity. It's pretty obvious. You can't accept anything of value for being influenced to do your federal government job. 203 and 205, representational services. As a federal employee, you cannot appear on behalf of somebody else to another federal agency. What does that mean? Your next door neighbor says, I need help with my Social Security. Could you maybe call them up and ask them a few questions? And that will be a neighborly thing to do. The problem is, it's totally illegal because you're a federal employee. We had in my old institute at NIH, someone who was going to law school at night. And one of the courses that she took was representing criminal defendants for free in federal court. And she came to see me and said, can I do this? And my response was no. It violates 205. And she knew that, which is why she asked. And she eventually quit the federal job, went to law school full time, and is now practicing law in the Midwest. Question?
I think what I heard you say, I mixed stories. A good Samaritan and someone trying to practice in a court of law on behalf of someone.
Right. Both
I
are
can call, well, I believe I can call on behalf of my mom or my neighbor and ask questions and support them in a process, but I can't officially represent them in a court of law or an administrative hearing or something like that. Am I misunderstanding a nuance?
Yeah, it is a nuance. First of all, if it's a relative, there's no problem at all. There's an exemption for relatives. But neighbors, no, you really can't even call up the Social Security Administration. That's considered representation. So, but for relatives, sister, brother, parents, grandparents, whatever, that's fine.
So there's the action. The action is first contact.
Employee, or what if you just said I'm Joe on the street? Like
yeah.
you didn't identify
yourself. The fact
yourself.
that you're a federal employee makes it impermissible. It doesn't matter whether you say you're a federal employee or not. Now, are we going to catch you if you don't admit it? Probably not. But the mere fact is that as a federal employee, you're not permitted to represent anybody else before another federal agency.
So represent.
Represent is a broad term. It's a very broad term. And it also has implications in post-employment issues, which we'll be getting to. The federal government doesn't have any concern about who you work for after you leave the employ of the federal government. However, there are issues regarding how you can represent that company, that entity, back to the federal government. You can pretty much do anything behind the scenes. But if you've worked on something, you can never represent that entity back to the federal government on the same thing. If you're a project officer on a contract at ONC, you went to work for the contractor. You can't then call up ONC and ask questions or visit with them, ONC. You can advise them in the background, but to do anything else violates the representation clause.
You can work behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes, no problem at all. Again, post-employment, that's pretty much what I said. And you should always ask the question. You're never going to get in trouble by asking a question. The purpose of the ethics program is not to prevent you from doing something. It's to enable you to do the things you need to do and not get in trouble. So always ask. 208 is the main conflict of interest statute in that it precludes you doing anything where you have a financial interest in a matter. And that includes the financial interest of you, your spouse, a dependent child, an organization you belong to. And a critical example would be at NIH, where we had this all the time, where people were doing clinical trials using certain drugs. It would be a conflict if they owned more than a certain amount of stock in a company producing that drug. Because in theory, they could influence the results, or at least it could be perceived as influence the results, on making a profit for themselves. So we always analyze that sort of thing. In theory, it's possible to get a waiver if there's a conflict of interest. In practice, it's very, very difficult. The Office of the General Counsel does not grant very many waivers for an actual conflict of interest. They will grant authorizations for the appearance of a conflict of interest, but not for an actual conflict. Section 209, the salary is payable only by the United States government. Well, it's pretty much what it says. You are banned from getting salary for your job from any other entity. Specifically, you're prohibited from working for foreign governments, and including some universities. Some universities, even though they're at the University of, pick a country, are considered to be entities of that foreign government. It's based on how they're structured and how they get their money and so forth. And you can't tell simply from the name of the institution. They have done an analysis of several hundred of these when it's come up and have lists. Yes, question. Have lists of universities that are considered to be entities of the foreign government and universities that are not considered to be entities of the foreign government. Again, ask the question. Yes?
But can you work for the government and also teach at the, I don't know, Phoenix or those sort of internet universities in United States?
Yes, but you have to get permission. That falls under the category of outside activity. You're doing something, requesting something that's not part of your official duties.
Okay.
If you want to do something outside, teach at an internet university, for example, yes, you can do it with permission. Permission by your supervisor, permission by the NIH, by the ONC deck who is handling it. And we'll do an analysis of the conflicts involved. There's also the Foreign Gifts and Declarations Act, which means you can't accept anything of value from a foreign government. However, there is a minimum amount and there's an exemption. So if you get invited, for example, to a reception at the French embassy, first of all, I would say invite me if you're out against it. Typically, there's a $350 exemption. If it's less than $350, you're allowed to accept it from a foreign government. Not in money, but in kind. And a nice bottle of wine, a nice spread on the table, probably not going to be $350. Again, ask the question, because you're probably going to be okay, but you never know. Gifts beyond minimal value, well, typically we don't get very many of those offers from foreign governments, but some government officials, in fact, do get very expensive gifts from foreign governments. It's embarrassing, could be embarrassing, to turn down the gift. You can accept it on behalf of the foreign government, on behalf of the United States government. It's then not your property, and you turn it over to the archives. Or if you really like it, you can find out what the value is, write a check, and pay for it. That works. I was once given a very nice poster by one of the disease groups. I really liked the poster. It was beyond minimal value, so I ended up writing him a check, have it hanging on my wall at home. There's one sort of conflict. A dental school with a hockey team, if you know hockey players. And the question is this a conflict? We have Weight Watchers and a donut shop. Well, this may be an appearance of a conflict. If Weight Watchers actually owned the donut shop, then there could be a financial conflict of interest, which could be a real conflict. If it simply happens to be in close proximity to the Weight Watchers group, then that's just the appearance of a conflict. So policy, well, it's very clear. The policy of the federal government is you don't have a conflict of interest. You have to be above reproach, like Caesar's wife. And there are various activities that you can do, outside activities. There are some gifts that you can accept. They're not really considered gifts. Honorary degrees can be accepted, again, with approval. Federal policy to avoid conflict of interest or the appearance. The appearance of a conflict of interest is about as bad as an actual conflict of interest, because it deteriorates public trust in the government. And a conflict of interest is anything that could impair your objectivity or create an unfair competitive advantage. An unfair competitive advantage for any person or organization. And it's more than just individual bias. You're hired because of your expertise. We know you have an individual bias. That's probably why we hired you. The trick is there can't be any interest, a financial interest usually, that would impair your work. So financial disclosure. Well, if you have any fiduciary responsibility, if you run a program, if you're a project officer, if you're in grants management, if you have any say at all about where money goes, then you have to file a financial disclosure form. And what we do is we look at that financial disclosure form. We compare it to your duties to see if there's a conflict. There are some holdings, some assets that are conflicts here. Microsoft, for example, or a company deals in health information can be a conflict. Now, there are some conflicts that we recognize as conflicts, but there's what we call a de minimis amount. You can earn a certain amount of stock, typically $15,000 or less, and it's not considered legally to be a conflict. It's an exemption to the conflict laws. The information on the confidential form is confidential. It can't be released. It's not releasable by FOIA. However, we want to make sure that you still don't have any information on there that's personal. You shouldn't have the name of your kids. You shouldn't have the name of your spouse. Because while it's not releasable by FOIA, Congress can, and sometimes does, request that information. So before it's released, we want to redact that out if there was anything in there, but it's best if it's not in there to begin with. And some of you have actually received emails from me saying, this is personal, it shouldn't be in there. Do I have your permission to redact it from the form? Which I will do. And we want to make sure that you just don't inadvertently violate any conflict of interest laws. We do look at the current year's forms and reconcile them with last year's forms. And if there's a discrepancy, I'll probably ask that question, or Kathleen will. So, what do we have? Well, there are process issues. And what I've done is I've analyzed all the financial disclosure forms at ONC for the past year. And I've come up with some problem areas that are very common. Some of them are serious, some of them are not serious, but it's best if they're resolved beforehand so we don't have to go back to you with emails. So the first page, sometimes the newer annual entrant box is not checked. It needs to be checked. If you're a new entrant, we need the date of appointment. A lot of people forget that. The other demographic information is not included. Your grade, your email, name of your supervisor, and so forth. Not all the boxes are checked in Part 2, Parts 1 through 5. Basically, there's a whole list of yes boxes and no boxes. And some people forget to check them, or they check the wrong boxes. If a box is checked yes, but there's no corresponding entry in there, then I'll see why. Similarly, if a box is checked no, but there is an entry, I'll have to reconcile that. At ONC, the 450 needs to be signed by the supervisor. Sometimes people forget to do that. And the supervisor doesn't date it. Now, under assets and income, sometimes an investment entry is listed without any of the underlying reportable assets being listed. What do I mean by that? There are some things that are not reportable. Diversified mutual funds, United States securities, money market funds. They're assets. You can have them. They're not reportable on the form. They've been specifically exempted by the Office of Government Ethics because they represent no conflict. However, there are some things that people list, like an IRA, a 401k, TIA pref, that really don't give me enough information. If you have an IRA, does it contain only diversified holdings? Does it contain sector funds, which are reportable? Does it contain individual stocks? I'll ask the question because we need to know. And in fact, if everything is diversified or non-reportable, that can be redacted and you wouldn't have to report it next year unless, of course, the contents change. Similarly with 401k, TIA CREF is usually the investment vehicles for retirement accounts at universities, medical schools, colleges, and so forth. Some of the underlying assets of TIA CREF are reportable, some are not. The stock fund is diversified. It's not reportable. The real estate fund is reportable. And so you need to specify what specific holdings you have that are reportable. In addition, I'll get to this later as well, since it's a retirement fund, there has to be a corresponding entry in Part 4, Agreements and Arrangements, because it's an agreement with a former employer. You have an agreement to get something later on, an annuity, maybe at age 65. So that has to be specified. Sometimes there's an agreement or arrangement listed, but none of the assets in that agreement are reportable. So you might have something in Part 4 that doesn't need to be listed in Part 1. Probably not the other way around. Sometimes the salary for an outside activity is included without an HHS 520. An HHS 520 is request for approval of outside activities. If you're doing something outside the federal government that requires the use of your professional skills, then you have to have a 520 that's been certified on file. Now, if you're painting houses, that's okay. You don't need a 520. If you're a holiday cashier at Macy's, that doesn't require a 520. Ask the question. Retirement account, I mentioned that. Life insurance. Well, there's whole, there's term, there's variable, and there's universal. Whole life insurance, term life insurance, universal life insurance, they don't have to be listed. Variable life insurance, however, has underlying assets that the person who's insured can pick. They can be diversified, they can be non-diversified. We have to ask the question about the type of life insurance, and if it's variable, whether there are underlying reportable assets. We have that. Sometimes you list an annuity, again, without the underlying reportable assets being specified. And sometimes there's a name there, and it's not really clear what that means. For example, I'll get into that a little later, and sometimes if your previous employer, which you list because you've come from the outside, is an academic institution, I will ask whether you have a retirement account with them. Because if you do, it needs to be listed in Part 4 and or in Part 1. I went over that before. Again, assets and income, there's over-reporting. You don't need to list federal government salary of you or a spouse. You don't need to list a savings account. That's exempt. The government thrift savings plan does not need to be listed, and so forth. I'm sure everybody in here knows precisely the difference between a diversified and a sector fund, but just in case you don't, diversified means just that. It has a wide range of stocks in it. It's broadly diversified across the entire stock market, and it's available to anybody. A sector fund invests in a very specific area. Can be real estate, can be media and telecommunications, biopharmaceutical, whatever. Those sector funds have to be reported because they're not diversified. Sometimes you'll list the name of a stock and it's not really clear what it is. It helps to have the ticker symbol involved. Or you list Vanguard Bond Fund. Well, Vanguard has a lot of bond funds. T. Rowe Price Mutual Fund. T. Rowe Price has 30 or 40 mutual funds. Without knowing exactly which one, we can't do the analysis. Some of them are diversified, some of them are not diversified. Sometimes you list the trust. Trusts typically have underlying assets. Some of them are reportable, some are not. An employee stock ownership plan. Well, it could be stock in that company. It could be stock in other companies. We'll have to ask the question if you don't list it. Real estate. You don't need to list your own real estate unless you're using it as income producing. If you have a vacation home and all you do is vacation there, you don't rent it out, it doesn't have to be listed. If you're renting it out, it has to be listed because it's income producing property. And you'll need to list the city and state where it's located. Spouse salary is not listed. The spouse 401k or IRA is listed, but there's no indication of the underlying assets. Now, a spouse retirement account does not need to be listed in Part 4. Only your retirement account has to be listed in Part 4. But the underlying assets, if they're reportable, have to be listed in Part 1. The spouse's employer necessitates a memorandum of caution being issued to the employee. For example, I'll give you an actual example from NIH. One of my program directors, their spouse worked at the University of Maryland. The program director handled grants that came in from around the country. I issued her a memorandum of caution saying, if you should ever get a grant from the University of Maryland, you're going to have to recuse yourself. You're not going to have anything to do with that. And she knew then that, okay, if something comes in from Maryland, Maryland was imputed to her because her husband was an employee there. It's that sort of thing. It can be a variety of other issues as well.
Yeah, let me
Kathleen.
just point out that nowhere on this confidential financial report do you have to list a dollar amount. You don't have to list the amount of money your spouse is making. You don't have to list a dollar amount of your diversified or non-diversified mutual funds or your stocks. We just need to know the names of the employers of your spouse and also the name of the stock. Now, if you were filing as an SES employee the
278.
the 278 form, you have to list everything, including bracketed amounts, trades, and so on and so forth. But you guys don't.
Right. The 278 is a much more complicated form. Kathleen said you have to list a range of the amount of stocks, where the assets come from, where the income comes from, and the amount of the income in brackets. Sometimes you will see that there's a reporter that says, okay, this Supreme Court justice or not has assets in the range of so-and-so. What they've done is they've analyzed the 278 for that Supreme Court justice, for that member of Congress, and come up with an amount that they have as assets. And there are reporters who do that every year. They literally request every financial disclosure form from every member of Congress, every Supreme Court justice, even the NIH.
The SES OGE 278 is called public financial disclosure form.
Right.
Yours is confidential.
As I said, some assets may be conflicts, but they fall below this de minimis level. Okay. There can be a sector fund in areas that deal with something that ONC has authority over. The de minimis for that is higher. It's about $50,000, but it depends on the individual circumstance. Ethics is very situational. I can't many times give you a blanket response to a general question. We need to know the specific details because that determines how the ethics analysis is done. Liabilities, well, if you get a mortgage under standard terms from a financial institution, that's not reportable. Student loans, they're not reportable as a liability. They're exempt. The Office of Government Ethics exempted them a few years ago. Outside positions, if you're a member of a professional organization, that doesn't have to be listed. If you're an officer of a professional organization, that has to be listed, and in addition, you have to get a 520, request to be an officer, because that typically is a fiduciary responsibility, and it needs approval. Sometimes people list the beneficiary of a trust as being a position, and that's not reportable. However, if you're a trustee of a trust, that is reportable. Ask the question. The trust beneficiaries, however, have to list the name of the trust in Part 1. And if there are any underlying reportable assets, they have to list those as well. Now, we have a fairly large manual that we have to consult when we're reviewing these things. And so, I know you sometimes will think this is picky, but we get audited. Agreements and arrangements, well, again, the retirement accounts and so forth. Sometimes people will list University of Humboldt, whatever, wherever it is, but they don't list any agreements or arrangements there. What are the terms? I'll be getting annuity at age 65. I'll be getting annuity when I retire. That needs to be listed as well. Not in great detail, but it does need to be listed. Gifts and travel reimbursements, well, generally, the most common mistake is you list federal travel as a gift. Government travel that the government is paid for is not a gift. We all know that. Ever been to Hanover, New Hampshire in February? It's not a gift. Trust me. Official duty activities. Those are activities that are performed as part of your job or an extension of your job. Okay? And it could be work performed with an outside organization, and you can do that with permission of your supervisor. And it has to be, of course, consistent with the mission and authority of ONC. You cannot perform an official duty activity with an organization that does any lobbying. That's a no-no. Because you can't take a position that would be contrary to the policy of the department. And since ONC is part of the Secretary's office, that's a pretty broad spectrum. You can use non-confidential information as available to the public if it's official duty. You can't use anything if it hasn't been publicly disclosed. You can't basically do anything contrary to ONC policy. Official duties and outside activities cannot be performed with the same organization. Okay? And in fact, if you do an official duty activity with an organization and then want to do an outside activity, there has to be a year cooling off period where you don't do anything with that organization. And you can't really do activity, official duty activity 12 months, outside activity 12 months. No, this switching back and forth is called switching sides. You can't do that. So there's some possible official duty activities. Manuscript review, if it could be considered within the nature of your job. Serving on an editorial board or editing a multi-author textbook. Okay? But you can't have any management, budget, or personnel responsibilities if you're an editor. And if the author of the multi-author textbook is a grantee of ONC, there's a conflict. And you need to have a year recusal period at least with that individual. Clinical practice is okay. You can be an adjunct faculty member, but there's a conflict of interest with the institution for a year. That's distinct from doing teaching as an outside activity. Now there's also a conflict there, and you have to have a recusal as well if you want to do something with the organization at ONC. Grand rounds, you can speak and attend the professional organization's events as official duty. ONC will travel you to a meeting, happens all the time. Grant review for government agencies is permissible if there are no ONC funds involved. You can be a member of a professional organization that doesn't require any permission, but an officer, as official duty, would require a waiver. I tried to get a couple of these. It's virtually impossible to get them anymore from the Office of General Counsel. They don't like the idea. They require reams and reams of documentation, and then after you submit it, it's typically not approved. Yeah, making a presentation or a later professional organization meeting, that can be done as an official duty activity. And of course, anything that's official duty, you can't get any compensation of any type. Certainly no money. Now we'll talk about some other types of things, coffee and donuts and so forth. That would be okay, they're not good. Now outside activities, those are not related to your current work. And you can do them, but you can't use any government resources. You can't use your government computer. If you have a cell phone or BlackBerry, you can't use that. Fax machine. Anything related to the government, you can't use an outside activity because you're misusing your position. It's the use of official position for private gain. It's not permitted. Now, there are some little exemptions. If you want to do something like send a joke on your government computer, it's minimal use. I don't know of anybody who doesn't do that, frankly. It's late, you need a copy of your tax return. I know at NIH, it's minimal use, they let you do that. I think the same thing applies at ONC. Outside activities involving professional work require advance approval. You cannot do anything that requires your professional expertise without getting advance approval. You can't do it until it's approved and signed and certified by the ONC DEC, Liz Hampton. Approval is only granted for a year at a time. If you want to continue doing it, you need to submit the approval typically about 2 months in advance of it, so we have time to process it. The processing usually doesn't take that long, but it's nice to get it in early, so you don't have to worry about it. You're going to have to report any annual activity you do as an outside activity on the 521. That needs to be done every year. Some outside activities don't require approval. Letters to the editor, that's fine. Homeowners Association, officer or board member. Even though it's an officer or board member, that's been specifically exempted by the Office of Government Ethics. A holiday cashier at Macy's and so forth, ask the question. That's why the ethics office is here. So what is the role of a supervisor? Some of you are supervisors.
No, there's
No supervisors?
This is not a supervisor.
Okay. In that case, I will just go over this very quickly. Your supervisor has to review it. They're in the best position to know what your duties are, and they want to also keep you from getting into trouble. So you can look at the slides later on, and we'll go from there. Okay. Gifts.
Quick question.
Yes, certainly.
We've talked about the 520 and
Right.
the 450.
Right.
The 521, that's a separate form?
That's a separate form. That's the annual report of outside activities.
Okay.
And some people make the mistake of saying, okay, I submitted a 521, that is asking permission to continue the activity for another year. And that's incorrect. That simply reports on the activities that you've done in the previous year. It can't be used to request approval for another year. You have to submit a new 520 for that.
And when's the 521 reporting period?
Typically, it's due like February 15th.
No,
No,
the
when's it?
521 is
Later this
due
year?
the 28th of February.
Okay.
And the form, in fact, says 28th February on it.
Right.
When you fill it out, it's for your outside activities for the previous calendar year.
Right. And it will ask the number of hours you devoted to it, the period of time, how much money you made, and you can list all your outside activities on a single form. You don't have to have separate forms like you would for 520. For 520, you need a separate form for each activity. The 521 will list all
It's a
your
summary,
activities
yeah.
if you have multiple activities. Gifts. Well, some gifts are permissible and some are not. As government employees, I'm sure we've all gotten plenty of offers of gifts. A gift is anything of value. Discount, entertainment, hospitality, loans, training, a variety of things. It is not modest items of food. Soft drinks, donuts, even though some people have made meals of these things. Little intrinsic value. A plaque, a certificate. If somebody would give you a lolly bowl, crystal bowl, very nice, that's more than minimal value. Now, if it had your name engraved on it, that takes away significantly from the value, but it still would be considered something of value. You ask the question as to whether you can accept it or you have to pay for it. Awards and prizes given to competitors in contests or events. One of my employees entered a raffle, won a laptop computer, asked whether they could accept it. The answer was yes. It's a raffle. It was open to anybody, not because she was a government employee. Anybody at the meeting could enter if they wanted to, and she won it. And there was an exemption. Anything that the government pays for is not a gift. Travel, used to be food. Government doesn't feed you very much anymore. Any gift accepted by the government, sponsored travel. Now, ONC doesn't really accept very much in the way of sponsored travel, but other agencies do. That means an outside organization wants you to come. They will make a gift to ONC of tickets. It can't be money anymore. It has to only be in kind. And that's a gift to the government. It's not a gift to you as the individual employee. Anything for which you pay market value is not a gift. That poster that I was given and I wrote a check for, that's not a gift. Widely attended gatherings. Well, sometimes you're at a meeting and sometimes there's a reception at a meeting. And the question is, can I go? Well, the reception is considered to be a gift. If it's not on the agenda, if it's on the agenda, it's part of the meeting, don't worry about it. But sometimes a pharmaceutical company might have this lavish reception. And you want to know, can I go? Well, the answer is probably, but it depends on the circumstances. It could be a widely attended gathering. Widely attended gathering means there's a lot of people there, usually more than 100, from a wide diversity of backgrounds, and you need to ask the question. And if you know about it in advance, you can ask and fill out the appropriate form, and there is a form for that, and get permission in advance. The WAG exception permits free attendance at certain widely attended gatherings, and it's, again, an exception to the gift rules. Now, the key points are that the free attendance can be a waiver of all or part of the conference or other fee. It can be food, it can be refreshments, it can be a meal, and so forth. Sometimes you're at a meeting. You don't know in advance that you're going to be invited somewhere. And the purpose is for you to be able to do your own ethics analysis. If the meeting is during ethics hours, during office hours, you can call Kathleen, ask her the question, tell her the circumstances, and you can get oral approval. If it's after hours, you do the ethics analysis. If your own analysis says, yeah, I think I can attend, you attend, have a good time, and when you get back to the office, then you report back to Kathleen, who will document it in the file. You can't get retroactive approval, but you can get things documented and put in your file, and every employee does have a file in the ethics office to make sure that nothing adverse comes of it. Free attendance for a widely attended gathering does not include travel expenses or lodgings. And widely attended gathering is a gift to the employee on a personal basis. And so if there's a reception, say downtown, you get permission to attend, and it starts at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Your standard hours begin at 5 and you want to be there at 4 o'clock, you will have to take an hour of annual leave or leave without pay or some type of official leave because you're not on government time. It's a private acceptance of a gift. Unless you traveled it, government has traveled you to an area like to a scientific meeting or a conference for the reception, you have to provide the travel on your own nickel. And again, you may need to take leave if you attend during business hours. Sometimes there are these receptions or events. We talked about that a little bit. Afternoon breaks at a meeting sponsored by a pharmaceutical company. They're not WAGs. You can attend those. They're usually even listed on the agenda, so they're part of the meeting. Events that are not planned or managed by the organization would require a WAG, the evening reception, and so forth. You might have to ask the question. Again, call the deck, call the ethics coordinator, to ask the question. Meals. Well, a full meal will be considered a gift, but if it's a meal associated with a speech, you can accept it. There's an exemption for that. You're invited to a lunch meeting. If you're the luncheon speaker, you give the lunch, you have lunch, you give the speech, you're good. Same thing with a dinner meeting. If you're the dinner speaker, or even part of a dinner panel, for example, you can accept anything else given to any of the other attendees. And in addition, you can accept free attendance at that conference for the day of the presentation. But you can't accept free attendance if it's a multi-day conference unless you're giving presentations on each day. The other days might require a WAG, so you have to know that. So you're invited to speak at a one-day conference of data inputters. Waiver of the registration fee and lunch from the sponsor of the event. If you go ahead and look at your other slide, you'll know the answer, which is yes. When you're assigned to participate as a speaker, you can accept free attendance at the event. You're speaking on behalf of the agency, and the gift is only for the specific day of the presentation, not for other days of the conference. And food, entertainment, anything given to all the other attendees, it's a very broad exemption to the gift rules. Sponsored travel, this is generally if you're going to some other agency, but there can be a gift to ONC. It happens a lot at NIH and the Intramural Research Program, where you're invited to give a speech, and the outside organization will pay for that. Patch Act. Well, in case you haven't noticed, there's going to be a presidential election later this year. And as government employees, there are certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. And it pays to know what they are. And again, some of the higher level employees have more restrictions. Commissioned officers have a lot more restrictions because they're on duty 24 hours a day, but there are certain restrictions on all employees. You cannot solicit, accept, or receive a donation or contribution for a partisan political party. Okay? You're a government employee, you can't do that. You cannot be a candidate for public office in partisan political elections. Now, school boards, for example, are typically not partisan. It's not Democratic, Republican, Whig, Green, whatever it is. They're usually nonpartisan. You could actually be a candidate for school board. You can't solicit or discourage participation of anybody who has business pending before ONC. You can't say, why don't you just stay here and not bother voting today? Or, you know, you have this really nice contract, but you should vote for X candidate. Obviously nobody would do it, but they think you might. You can't actually, while wearing a uniform or in a federal facility, do anything like wear a campaign button or wear a t-shirt with a candidate's picture on it, because that's political advertising. You are prohibited from doing that. There's even the issue of bumper stickers. Now, ONC doesn't have its own parking lot. NIH have a lot of parking associated with it. And you cannot come in with your car plastered with stickers, bumper stickers. That's considered a rolling, movable advertisement for a candidate. There was actually a ruling on this, but they said you can have one bumper sticker. Now, I don't know if it's one bumper sticker per candidate, but one bumper sticker. That's not considered to be a conflict. But don't start, well, first of all, it messes up the paint, but don't start. You can't distribute campaign items while on government time, or you can't perform any campaign-related duties, a variety of things. You cannot host, invite others to, or collect contributions for political fundraisers. So, if your spouse is not a federal employee, they can do this. You, however, cannot participate in any way. It might be nice even if you just simply went to a movie that night. But don't start, greeting guests and doing all these things. I know it's hard, but you're not permitted to participate in any way. Never forward a political email. Never send a political email from your government computer. You will be in trouble. Okay. However, you are permitted to be a candidate in nonpartisan elections. School, you register and vote, by all means. Assisted voter registration drives, of course. You can contribute money to political campaigns. You can attend fundraising functions. You can hold office in political clubs or parties. You can sign and circulate nominating positions. You can distribute campaign literature, a variety of things, express opinions, but don't let on you're a government employee. Okay? And sometimes what happens, and it's a little bit of, we get into social media, you will say on your Facebook page or whatever page you're on, oh, I work at ONC and I'm advocate for this candidate. Not a good idea. You want to do that in your total private capacity. We won't go into that. If you have specific questions, ask the ONC Ethics Office. These things are very situational. And as I said, never forward or send a political email. The Office of the Special Counsel has no tolerance for this.
Can you return 2 slides back? I'm sorry to have interjected. I thought I said something, I saw something about forwarding petitions.
This one?
The slide after this one, on what folks are permitted to, yeah.
Not in your government.
Not on your government computer.
No government computer.
Clearly understood.
Yeah, private computer
I
with
thought I
no
heard that sorry, show the rest of the slide?
Yeah.
So hold office in political clubs or parties. I swear 5 slides ago it said that I couldn't be affiliated as an officer in any professional organization. Or something along those lines without submitting beforehand.
Right, exactly. Okay. There are
So that's
differences
about
between
submitting a 520
That's
one?
submitted at 520. Now, political organizations are not really considered to be professional organizations in the same sense that a disease group where you're the president of the disease group and you're responsible for raising money. There are certain very specific exemptions for political activities versus these private organizations. And so the question is, or the response I would say is, ask the question. Because these things are all very situational.
Yeah, I took an emphasis of one of your remarks.
Yeah.
Distribute campaign literature in partisan elections. Some of these things about what you just can't do as a government employee.
Certainly.
At the level of perception, it shows there may be some issue.
Yeah.
But here, if you file the right forms, so certainly you can sign
For the
and
Hatch
circulate
Act, pretty much
petitions.
you don't need to file too many forms. Where other things you do need to file forms. So, again, ask. I'm
not sure what I can ask now or what the answer is going to be.
As I say, it's very situational. We actually have to consult we have to consult the regulations many times to actually see how the interpretation is. And the Office of Government Ethics has what they call letters on their website where people have asked very specific questions and they've interpreted that specific question for that individual. It's like an individual ruling by the IRS on a tax situation. They call letter rulings. Same thing with OG, Office of Government Ethics, they do the same thing. So, all very situations. So, again, the Office of Special Counsel doesn't give any second chances about forwarding political emails or sending political emails from your government computer. If you do it, and they catch you, you're gone. Yeah.
Yeah, I interned there.
Oh, okay. Is that true then?
I got to see some of these emails. And the first thing they'll do, once they get the email forwarded to them, is they'll pull this attendance sheet that says you are at the ethics training that.
Right.
And when they call you, they'll say, did you attend the ethics training on February 21st, where the Hatch Act was discussed? And like, that's absolutely what they'll do. And yeah, it's not always dismissal, but there will be a
It can be very severe.
It can be dismissal.
Yeah, question.
Just a quick one with regard to showing photos of partisan politicians in your office as it applies to the Hatch Act. Can you remind me how that goes? I forgot.
Don't show, well, many offices have pictures of the president, because he's president. Okay, that's okay. But you can't have on your desk a picture of one of the candidates for an office.
If it's about their candidacy, what if it's about, I mean, obviously I'm thinking our job in congressional affairs is to relate with a wide audience of folks.
No, you're right.
And so for that reason, Ron Paul may in fact be on someone's desk as a HIT supporter or something. Is that what you're getting? Is that?
It's all of that stuff. And it's as much in a political election year as in not.
Yeah, sometimes, well, as you get to an election year, it gets really tough.
That was why I asked, because I can't remember.
Sometimes what happens is you've met somebody.
Right.
You know, I met Newt Gingrich one time, okay? I didn't have my picture taken with him. I met him at a congressional seminar. And if I had my picture taken with him, and I put it on my desk, or anybody, it was just something, yeah, I met this candidate, or sometimes I have this whole series of things. I collect pictures of myself with candidates, or politicians, and they happen to be running. Is that a political advertisement? Or is that something innocuous?
Yeah, that's your personal memorabilia.
Personal memorabilia. What I would do is just simply not have anything like that around in the political season, just to make sure, because you don't know what's going to happen if somebody comes into your office and gets offended by it, whether it's innocuous or not. So why ask for trouble? Yeah, okay. Social media, well, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, a variety of things are social media. They're interconnected ways of communication, YouTube. The Office of Management and Budget has issued what they call an open government directive encouraging government agencies to use these things. Up until about a month ago, NIH employees were absolutely prohibited from using Facebook. If you tried to get there on an NIH computer, software blocked you from getting there. Okay, I don't know what they do now, but they came out with some guidelines for using this, so I think it's okay to get there. However, it's just like you getting up and giving a speech. You cannot indicate that you're a federal employee when you're on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, because you might advocate something that is against the policy of the agency, and that's not something you can do. So when you communicate using it, you represent HHS, and you can state only unauthorized messages when you're using it as a federal capacity. Okay? It's no different than standing at a podium and delivering a clear speech. And you can't fundraise for any particular charity or cause, release any non-public information. Again, this is in an official capacity. Now, there's also some problems in a non-official capacity. We'll get to that. In a personal capacity, you act as a private individual. You can express personal opinions, but you're subject to certain limitations, such as the Hatch Act fundraising prohibition. You can't do that. And which applies even during off-duty hours. Scenario. You own $55,000 to a pharmaceutical company. If you were on the HHS Facebook site, could you say that this company does a superior job and should be awarded an FDA contract? Well, the answer is no. You have a financial conflict of interest. You own money in that pharmaceutical company, so you cannot advocate for that pharmaceutical company. It's pretty much common sense. YouTube is a subsidiary of Google. You own $65,000 in Google stock. Congratulations. And you're asked to join a team to decide whether HHS should keep its YouTube channel or move to another social media. Well, no. Again, it's a conflict of interest. If you're on a committee deciding whether HHS should maintain its Google channel, and you own stock in Google, and they move it, you want a lot of Google stock. You can't do it. You serve in your spare time for the committee of Kinderworld nonprofit organization daycare center. Can you post an official notice on the agency's website that they're seeking application. Think care centers, yes, you're not an officer, you're not a trustee, you're not any director of that, and therefore its financial interest is not imputed to you, and it's not a financial conflict of interest. Ask the question. Past employers, well, you have a covered relationship with anybody you worked for before you came to ONC. It's usually if you've been to ONC less than a year. And this means that somebody could question your impartiality with that employer, so you would have to recuse yourself. 2006, a senior official of the Interior Department resigned after allegations surfaced that he tried to steer a $2 million contract with a technology firm. Well, the problem was that it was true, and he had a financial conflict of interest with the previous employer and tried to steer money to that company. Not a good idea. Again, I already gave you the answer. Misuse of position. Standards of federal conduct say you can't use your position for your own private gain. You cannot ask anybody for money for doing your job. You can't endorse any product or service or enterprise as part of your position. You can't disclose non-public information. For example, can an employee utilize ONC data as part of their master's thesis? Well, the answer is it depends. You have to know whether the thesis is being paid for by ONC. Are the data that the employee wants to use publicly available? Is the employee obtaining information the same way that a non-employee would? These are all good questions. So the answer is probably not, unless the data were publicly available on the ONC website. And you can't, the employee can't utilize any government resources while preparing your thesis. No fax, no copier, no computer. Do it on your own computer. So the bottom line is, if it doesn't feel right or comfortable, then just don't do it. It's always a good idea to ask your questions. Common sense is good to have. Or in other words, can you help me with my ethics homework, or would that be missing the point? Yes, that would be missing the point. So we give you a lot of information. If you don't remember all the rules, the ethics office is here to help, and you can submit all your questions to Kathleen Pfeiffer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.